The Progressive Era, a time of immense change in American life, a time when a number of social and political progressive movements had a lot of power in American politics. Today, we're going to talk about the president who kind of ended this era, Woodrow Wilson. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of you that I put Wilson as the worst president, because he isn't universally seen as a bad president. So, in this video, we'll see why he should be seen that way. So, let's start with some backstory. Wilson was born in Virginia in 1856. His family would move further into the South to Georgia when he was 2 years old. He witnessed the Civil War as a child from the Southern perspective, and as a teenager, he grew up with resentment towards the Confederacy's loss. His youth would end up shaping a lot of his views throughout his career. He later became a historian and pushed some very dangerous ideas, like the Lost Cause narrative, which is about how the Confederacy, even though they fought to keep slaves, were really the good guys in the Civil War. He also pushed the idea that America was the nation chosen by God to make the world a better place. With these ideals, Wilson entered politics as a Democrat, of course, because it was the party of the South, segregation, racism, all of that stuff. After a short stint as governor of New Jersey, Wilson was nominated for president in 1912 by the Democrats. Now, Wilson was from the South, and the last Southerner to be elected president was Zachary Taylor in 1848, over 60 years before this, which means Wilson had virtually no chance of winning in a normal election. The problem was, 1912 was far from a normal election. The story starts in 1908. The extremely popular President Theodore Roosevelt just ended his second term, and then he told America to vote for William Howard Taft, who was supposed to be exactly like Roosevelt, except he's super fat. Ultimately, people listened, and Taft became president in 1908. The two of them continued being really good friends. However, after a while, Teddy realized that Taft wasn't Roosevelt 2.0, and in 1912 he decided to run against him in the Republican National Convention. The Republicans ultimately chose Taft, and Roosevelt was all like, "Fuck you, and I will make your children watch." As you can see, the guy is very pissed off. So he stormed out of the convention, gathered his most trusted friends from the GOP, and created his own party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party, and ran on that ticket. So in this election, we have four main candidates. They all interestingly ran on pretty left-wing platforms, especially Eugene Debs. The election then happens, and holy crap. The split in the Republican Party ended up favoring the Democrats very heavily, even though Wilson only got 41% of the popular vote. And just a quick side note, because I have too much free time, I decided to merge the votes between Taft and Roosevelt just to see if the split in the GOP really decided this election. Well, turns out it definitely did. Anyway, there was a bit of controversy after Wilson's election, mostly because he opposed women's suffrage, going against Roosevelt on this issue. This pushed women to organize a huge march in Washington, D.C. the day before Wilson's inauguration. I mean, not the best of starts, but surely not a sign for what's to come. Nonetheless, Wilson was inaugurated, and now he had to start working as president. He started with what he called the New Freedom. It included a huge number of changes in the economy that are relatively progressive. Here are some of the highlights. So he helped in implementing the new income tax system and then moved America towards more free trade by drastically lowering tariffs. Wilson also pushed for some banking reform, creating the Federal Reserve and all the complicatedness that comes with it. He then created the Federal Trade Commission, which helped fight trusts, monopolies, and unethical business practices. Then you have the 8-hour workday, the ban on child labor, workers' compensation, like some pretty good things were done here. However, when you compare this new freedom to Roosevelt's new nationalism, or even, dare I say, Eugene Debs' socialist platform, it starts to look like a very conservative attempt at progressivism. But still, it was a step in the right direction at least. His reformist attitude didn't contain itself only within economic policy, but also social policy. But this time, Instead of being progressive, he was regressive. Now, just so you understand, the leaders of the progressive era in the early 20th century were typically fairly racist. But no one ever got to the level of racism Woodrow Wilson engaged in. I mean, the guy was on another level. He had a very complicated hierarchical system when it came to the races. And of course, black people are at the bottom. Speaking of black people, since he was a lost cause historian, he opposed their right to vote, believed that slavery wasn't as bad as people think it was, saw it as a more benevolent state for black people, and only opposed it for economic reasons. He also openly endorsed the KKK, a white supremacist terrorist group, and while reflecting on the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, he wrote that it placed Southern white men under the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant n***s. Yes, he really said that. These racist views definitely manifested themselves in his policies as president. So here's an example. Now, at the time, there was segregation, but it only happened at the state level through the Jim Crow laws. Wilson was a firm segregationist, and he wanted to extend these laws further than just the states. So he started quietly segregating the federal government, basically demoting all black people in the workforce, and if they were lucky, forcing them to hold low level positions. Wilson just basically introduced Jim Crow to the federal government. He got significant opposition from black leaders and Republicans, but Wilson wasn't deterred since he believed he was actually helping black people and saw that segregation was necessary as it would improve race relations and eliminate friction between the races, whatever that means. In reality, this policy really hurt African Americans who were used to finding relative equal opportunity in the federal workforce. As if this wasn't enough racism, he decided to screen The Birth of a Nation in the White House. Now, the film is about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it constantly warped reality to make black people look like inherent villains and violent savages. And it also made the KKK look like heroes, and it even quoted Woodrow Wilson several times, using some of the most racist quotes of his. Now, Wilson's endorsement of this unbelievably racist movie, coupled with its popularity, galvanized Southern racists to revive the KKK, which had died in the 1870s thanks to US grant. These people would go on to commit violent acts against black people, and race relations were never worse than during Wilson's presidency, and it's partly because of him. As you can see, irresponsible behavior was certainly a trend when it came to Wilson, and this wasn't the only example of that. His foreign policy, especially in Latin America, was mired with this problem. Now, Americans at the time were tired of colonialism, especially after what happened in the Philippines. So Wilson just couldn't get away with colonizing stuff all willy nilly. He had to do the next best thing. He created a new foreign policy ideology, which came to be known as Wilsonian idealism. So, instead of using military force to colonize, he would use it to change regimes and make countries comply to American ideals, which is code for American hegemony, at least according to Wilson. Now, the US had already been intervening all around the world as part of Roosevelt's big stick policy. Teddy was aggressive to say the least, but his interventions were usually very short and only done for American interests and nothing more. Wilson was different, however. He once said, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men," and he was determined to do so. He applied his theories to the Haitian Republic. Now, at the time, it was an extremely unstable country. I mean, they had like 6 presidents in the span of like 4 years, which is just the definition of unstable. Wilson decided to intervene in order to help the country recover. Big quotation marks on that, by the way. We all know why he did it. So the army quickly took over the capital, and eventually the whole country. America basically seized control of Haiti's banks and customs revenue, they rewrote their constitution to be more favorable for American business interests, and they installed a pro-US president. The intervention quickly turned into an occupation that would last until 1934, and didn't succeed in creating a stable government, and the country has been suffering ever since as a result. Though this isn't the first time America engaged in regime change, it was the first time they did so directly, through military force. A similar intervention and occupation took place on the other side of the island, in the Dominican Republic. This occupation lasted until 1924. Nicaragua also fell victim to Wilson's occupations. And well, you can guess what happened. Same shit, different country, really. Now, all of these occupations were part of the larger Banana Wars, and they only helped American businesses, not the people they're occupying. Believe it or not, Wilson's involvement in the Americas does not stop there. Throughout Wilson's presidency, Mexico was going through a revolution, some pretty troublesome times. A certain Victoriano Huerta seized power in Mexico in early 1913. Wilson then decided to get involved by questioning Huerta's claim to the Mexican presidency. Why? Well, apparently he just wasn't a big fan of the guy, and that's it. Yes, that's the actual reason. So, because of this, he went as far as instituting an arms embargo on Mexico and supporting rebels in the north. So, shit started to hit the fan when some Mexican officials arrested a group of American sailors in the port of Tampico. Dude, why'd you do that? Apologize to me right now. Yeah, man, I know. Really unfortunate event. We deeply apologize. Nothing like this will ever happen again. Trust me. We'll release the Americans. Don't worry about it. What? That's it? Yes. Oh, that's a weak apology at best. You should at least, salute the American flag or something. What? No! That's just childish. I'm not doing that. After this happened, Wilson got angry for some reason and started planning revenge. Once he heard about a German ship illegally carrying weapons to Mexico, he got an excuse to literally invade the country, entering the port of Veracruz, which was the destination of the ship, and engaging in a very bloody battle. Let me remind you that Wilson invaded Mexico because they didn't agree to salute the American flag, which, by the way, they never even did, even after the invasion. And that German ship that gave Wilson the reason to invade, well, it just changed course and unloaded the weapons in a different port. So this affair was just pointless any way you look at it. A little bit later, a group of American allies called the Constitutionalists, led by Venustiano Carranza, seized power in Mexico. Now, the Mexican Revolution was still going on, and had kinda turned into a civil war. And all of a sudden, fights in the north of Mexico were getting out of hand, and some of them even started to enter American territories, which was a big no-no for Wilson. When a bandit called Pancho Villa started to raid a bunch of American communities, Wilson sent General Pershing on a punitive expedition through the border to capture Pancho Villa dead or alive. The Carranza government weren't big fans of this expedition, even though Villa was their enemy, so they ended up also fighting Americans. The whole thing just became super confusing, and Pancho Villa was never captured. The Americans eventually retreated and completely abandoned the expedition. And this is after they became involved in a different conflict, a bigger one, a more international one, you could say.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy?